GM. And by GM, I mean GM if you're on the West Coast. If you're on the East Coast, good afternoon. If you're in Europe or somewhere else, probably good night. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nicole Benham, the host of this show, the DeFi State, a weekly show brought to you by Hashflow. And I'm also head of community for Hashflow. I host this show with my co-host and the CEO of Hashflow, Varun, who for some reason is unable to get on stage. Something's going on with Twitter Spaces, and I don't know what it is. We'll figure that out. But there we go. There we go. Hey Varun, good to have you.
Hello, thank you.
Thank God. Just to expand on what I was saying, if you are eager to learn and expand your mind when it comes to DeFi, this is the right place for you. Also, if you want to share this space with your friends, you can always click on the arrow at the top right of the space, copy the link, tweet it out to your feed, text it to your friends, whatever works. Our special guest today is Ken Deeter from Electric Capital. Ken, how are you?
Great. Thanks for having me on. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you great.
Awesome.
Great.
Nicole, I think one of the reasons why I was telling you like Ken would be a great guest is because I think we generally talk about how do we make things easier, how do you onboard new people into DeFi slash, there's so much to learn about and things like that, and where to start. That's usually a big lingering question amongst many. And I felt like Ken he's got really, really good insights around all these questions that you usually have for me, both around basics of DeFi and also some pretty good insights about protocol designs and where the trend is going and things like that. So I think this would be a good discussion around those topics. So just to give you a bit more context.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And Ken, I've looked through your tweets. I actually pinned one right now. So let's start there. For a new person who's just coming into DeFi, and of course there's so much going on, what's a good way to learn? Where do people start?
Yeah, so I think the space doesn't make it easy for anyone. Everything from just the space moving super quickly to people kind of deliberately being kind of arcane and obtuse about things, and that sort of almost being a point of pride. If you look at some of the apps that people build, they look either very old school or very technical, and it really reminds me of like a lot of the early open source world where people would kind of signal in the same way. That all being said, I think the thing that's helped people that I talk to the most is trying to get that basic set of primitives in your head. DeFi is a sort of ecosystem that's trying to rebuild financial infrastructure from the ground up, and so there's sort of like a core set of Lego pieces that if you kind of can wrap your head around, then you can kind of go from there and start to learn some of the more interesting and complicated things. And so the thread that you pinned is something that earlier this year I just I had so many of these conversations that I said, okay, let me just collect some really kind of just the core basic ideas, dexes and lending markets and things like that, and start from there, and tell people, go learn about these things first, and especially at the time, if you were around in DeFi 6 months ago, and had been in the space for a while, everyone kind of understood that a lot of the projects that were coming up day to day were just forks of existing projects with like slight tweaks made to their token mining program or what have you. And so really, if you just understood kind of where these things came from and what the sort of origin projects were, then it would really help you sort of absorb the rate of change in this space in a much more efficient way, and you're kind of not just getting overwhelmed with every new project. I think there was one coming out almost every day in DeFi summer. So that's kind of where that came from.
So I was going to say, if you were to pick like 4 basic principles in terms of where what's a good place to get started, if there are any resources that you recommend to anyone as a primer that allows them to just get started, are there particular areas that you suggest looking for?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like pretty well outlined in that thread. It's funny
Yeah.
because despite having written that, 6 months ago, I don't think
Has anything changed?
Yeah, not really. Like, obviously the stuff on the leading edge has changed, but understanding what smart contracts are, like understanding what an ERC-20 is, understanding that like the really basic ideas around, like how like the early version of Uniswap worked, the early version of, like compound lending, like how these things can create markets out on this blockchain software where there's sort of no central operating company. Like if you a lot of the ideas in those in just those core set of ideas are used in like almost every new project today still. So that's honestly that's where I would start. And it's I've kind of toyed with like trying to rewrite this thread, updating it with new stuff, and I've just kind of resorted to tacking stuff onto the end, because the stuff you should start with really, I think, really hasn't changed. I think there are a few other Twitter accounts out there that have similar types of content, but yeah, they all kind of end up revolving around the same stuff.
What about for someone who actually knows like nothing about this space and is like, oh well, I just use, JP Morgan Chase, or like I go to Bank of America. What's the point of DeFi at all?
Yeah. I think for those folks, if you're interested in learning, I mean, I think the best way to do it is just to take, $50 and just go play with everything. Thankfully, gas prices on Ethereum might be low enough where you can do some of that stuff. And now we have, these layer twos and other platforms where you can play with a core set of stuff and not, spend a lot of money. And it really takes, at least for me, who's kind of looking at new stuff all the time, I always find that visceral sense that you get from actually just pushing buttons on an app and seeing what it does is like irreplaceable. Even if you sort of understand it academically, what it's supposed to do, that feeling of like, oh, it was like that easy to move money from, my Coinbase account to my MetaMask wallet. It was really easy to like go to this site and I didn't have to type in any of my like information to like deposit $5 and earn interest on it. Like that experience, it's hard to really describe in a way for people who've never thought about those kind of questions to experience that. So that's what I always recommend is like if some I talk to a lot of developers that are curious about the space, and I'm just say, hey, just go take a small amount of money and go play with these things and see both the kind of the power and the things that they can do, but also kind of all the pitfalls and the shortcomings that exist in the space today.
I love that. I'm gonna start telling people go play with $50. That is a great way for people to learn. Varun, what's your take on that?
I think a general take around like is the question still like people who are using JP Morgan Chase, and what's the incentive for them to switch to crypto, or how do we onboard them to crypto? So
yeah. I mean, I think that so JP Morgan is interesting, right? Like people who have access to U.S. financial institutions, they are the ones that have access to probably at least the most sound financial system in the world. And obviously opinions differ on that too, but generally speaking, and so I think it's hard to come to those folks and say, hey, like, look, you can do lending or whatever.
I think generally my feel is like if for something like US where the banking infrastructure is already pretty decent and people have things taken for granted, it's hard for them to realize the value of DeFi or crypto right away. On the other hand, there are countries where this is not quite the luxury. I think that's where you kind of see like the crypto revolution start first, begin over there. Like if you look at Venezuela or things where their own state issued currency is not quite as
Yeah.
stable, and they're reliant on something like dollar. So in this case, having a depoliticized money that they can just use without being at the clutches of any other supermassive government around the world, I think that's kind of a big feature for them, right? So which is where when you ask people, ask what's the big use case for crypto, I think that is the use case, right? So you basically have a depoliticized, like uncensored money that you could be using for anything, and that's actually a pretty powerful thing, especially for countries where this kind of banking infrastructure is not available, right?
Yeah.
Uh, uh, but that being said, I think given the series of events that have taken place in the past 8 months or so, I think many people are realizing the value of open source finance. It's just that I think the way we communicate these things to people may not be we may not be speaking into their listening, right? So which is kind of where there's the divide. I think because it's like you can tell people like, this is so cool, this you can do these things, but then to many people it just sounds like they don't mean anything, right? So people just want to go open an app and transact, and they want these things, this complexity to be abstracted away. So which is kind of where it comes down to DeFi fundamentals, like what Ken you said that uh, a lot of the current DeFi landscape still feels like the early days of the internet, or like a bit hacky, where you essentially writing code and your UI kind of reflects what your smart contract looks like, and it's less empathetic to a user who doesn't really care about those details, and they just want to have something simple that they can use and move funds around, or it resonates with the concepts that they're already familiar with, right? So I think that's sort of where uh, I think in my opinion that's where DeFi is currently. I think the next set of evolution should revolve around how do you see why more consumable to regular consumers that
Wait,
things
Varun.
simple.
Varun.
Yes.
I think something's off with your Wi-Fi. Ken, are you hearing that, or is that just
Yeah.
me?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's something that's making your voice shaky and interrupting it.
Hey.
Is
Sorry.
it always?
Yeah.
No, it's still bad.
Yeah. I was gonna say. Yeah. I generally agree a lot with what Varun's saying. I've been surprised as I've gotten deeper into this. You know, you learn about people living in other countries, and they kind of all want to hold US dollars. They want to hold US stock assets, and it's surprisingly hard in a lot of countries that you would be surprised that is actually difficult to do this. You know, like there's so many countries where like bank regulations are not strong. There's stories about bank managers like running away with we think the FTX is bad, but like you know in a smaller scale, like these types of things happen in a lot of countries all the time, and there's just like really literally no way to like hold this stuff. And so obviously there's a technological hurdle to get over into those countries, but once that's there, the value is actually like quite clear, and I think that's one of the reasons that stablecoins seem to have pretty good product market fit within DeFi today.
Oh yeah, 100%. And it's crazy that nobody talks about what happens in those other countries, because right now, like FTX is the big story, and at least I barely hear about what's happening over there, where DeFi is a very clear solution to the problems that they're having.
Yeah, totally. And I think this is actually a common pattern in like early sort of early kind of stages of like new types of technology. You end up with like multiple approaches kind of competing in the market. And then there's some set of things that happen that's sort of like the natural selection event that makes it clear why certain types of architectures are better than others. So, I would say, and if you look outside of crypto, privacy is sort of like one of the big things now, right? Like, now we see, the real contrast between, let's say, the Apple approach to privacy and the Google approach to privacy, and there are more and more things happening in the market that like make that clear to everyone involved, and and depending on what you want, that's a clear differentiator now. Whereas that might not have been true when smartphones were just coming out, and some of these services were brand new, and people were just excited about the value that they provide and not really understanding what they're giving up on the other side of it. And I think DeFi versus CeFi to me has a clear trade-off like that too, where the risks that you're obviously CeFi is more efficient and a lot cheaper and et cetera, but there's a certain set of risks you're taking on, and it takes a series of events like this for people to realize that DeFi, the DeFi way of doing things is differentiated and can make sense in a lot of cases, and potentially is actually the right way to go forward in a space like crypto, where it's really unclear if there's can be like one single jurisdictional oversight body for the whole ecosystem. It seems like that's sort of not possible and not what people want anyways, and so we have to rely on these other mechanisms.
Yeah, I want to go back to what the privacy and the concern about that and data and what you just touched on, which is like the Apple way and the Google way. Can we elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I would say I mean it's not quite black and white. There's shades of gray, and like both companies have come out in the past like talking about privacy and stuff. But I would say on the whole, Apple has taken an approach that is much more sort of like privacy centric than Google has. Google's sort of if you think about all the way back to how Google sort of got started, their business model is indexing the internet and sucking in all the data that they can and using that information to provide search results, but also just like very useful contextual information and applications to people. And I think they've succeeded at that. But at a certain scale, people start to wonder, how much like this thing knows everything about me. How much trust can we place in one company to like really manage that clearly? And obviously, there's different levels of comfort with that. Whereas Apple, especially I think there was an announcement like a few days ago where they're saying, you can even essentially self-custody or encryption keys so that, your iCloud backups and things like that are also encrypted at rest on the Apple side, and they can't actually even see those things anymore. And so they're moving in a very different direction. Honestly, that looks a lot more like kind of how crypto people think about stuff. And I think there's going to be, if there is an event at some point where Google gets subpoenaed for something, or something is going to happen where more and more people sort of understand the trade-off between these approaches. And until that happens, it's just kind of abstract to people, and they don't really get it, and that's normal.
Yeah, I do feel like most people don't get it. What they're giving up on the other side when they're using, Apple or Google applications or anything like that. Varun, you back?
Oh, I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank God.
All right. No, so I got rug pulled for a moment. I think for some reason I was having this trouble with the link today, even when I was joining. I'm not sure why, but carry on.
Okay, great. So, yeah, I still want to be on. I still want to stay on this subject because there are some people that they don't really care, when they're using any application, what's happening on the other side, or maybe they're just not aware of it. But then there are some people that are so concerned about the information and the data that other companies have on them. What should we be concerned about? Because there's even talk about like KYCing our wallets, like in this space. So what should we be concerned about?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different takes on that. There's certainly folks that are working on very kind of like privacy folk, whether it's sort of the ZK approach or kind of very privacy focused L1s. There's kind of different approaches to all of this. I think the sort of, if you kind of port over your thinking from TradFi, obviously when it comes to financial data, that's always been one of the more sensitive pieces of data out there, whether it's sort of your personal finances or whether it's sort of your business finance, your company's finances. And certainly there's a direct line that you can draw from seeing having a view into everyone's financial data and being able to take advantage of that for yourself economically. And so, you know, I think one of the things that you always have to be careful of is kind of what everyone's always going to have a financial incentive to take advantage of this data if you can see it, and it's just a matter of, are the controls good enough, and like, how's it going to happen eventually. And the thing that people also don't realize is that there's something downstream of that, right? Which is, even if I don't see your credit card transactions directly, based on what you search, I can sort of tell probably what you're going to buy, what kind of things you buy, probably what income tier you're in, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a lot of behavioral data that can get correlated and basically tell you the same information. I think there was the really famous example of like Target sending like product ads for products, pregnancy products, to like someone's house, and the parents saw it and they didn't even know their daughter was pregnant, or something like that, right? Like and so that kind of stuff, I think, obviously the AI tech is getting better and better and able to spot these patterns. So even if someone's not being intentional about it, I think you'll end up with a bunch of these like strange and sometimes creepy and scary outcomes that will become more commonplace. And really the fundamental way to fight that is to be really careful about how you partition who can see your data and how it can be combined on the other side.
So, Ken, I had a maybe somewhat related, not related topic, or just steering that direction.
Sure.
So, in terms of DeFi applications currently, like what are you, what sort of the approach you think could be interesting? So, what's the trend you're observing currently, and where do you think the sweet spot would be where we preserve these fundamental values around data privacy and permissionless nature of it, but at the same time also able to build like applications that actually meet the current bar in terms of just a good UX, right? Because I think one of the fundamental barriers of entering into crypto is like not having access to crypto, and then fiat being the entry point into getting your first crypto, right? So on the other hand, if you introduce KYC and such to onboard people, then you basically somewhat becoming like a centralized application.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if that's a good trade-off or bad trade-off, right? And then not to mention the UX around on-chain transactions, where if no one is using the network, then I guess an Ethereum mainnet is pretty cheap. It's fine. But the moment you start seeing more activity, it gets really expensive to the point that you cannot really use it. And I think that's where it's kind of like a retail may not be able to use something like that. And I'm curious to hear, like, what's your general macro view on these sort of things, and where do you think is a sweet spot, or where things are headed?
Yeah. So I think you're right on that last question. It is a bit of a moving target right now. Obviously, if anyone who's been in the space for I guess probably about a year now, two like $100 transactions were not were pretty commonplace. Not 9 months ago. And I don't think, despite the merge and everything, until we get to really like sharded ETH, I don't see the Ethereum mainnet becoming particularly more scalable if you just look at kind of the core Ethereum stuff. And so that's where other chains and Solana and layer twos and all these things kind of things come in. The particular lull that we're in right now is sort of hiding that a little bit, just because Ethereum transactions have become cheap again. But I don't if any of this stuff works, I don't expect that state to continue. And I think we very much end up in sort of a tiered model where most kind of lower value transactions, whether that means it's an application that is like more of a game or like a social application or something, where there isn't financial value tied to a particular operation, or maybe we talk about just retail versus institutional, just amounts of value being transferred around every transaction, and the amount being custodied ends up in these different tiers. And I think that's where you start to see maybe some of the kind of the lower value tiers move on to the other places. And we're just happen to be in this lull where I think that's delayed. But as soon as sort of things settle down here and the numbers start growing again, I I don't see this current situation of like cheap transactions on Ethereum like really sustaining for a long time. I mean, we've already seen days, even in the last few weeks, where like we see very expensive transactions just on a very short basis. In terms of your other question of how we bring more people into the space, I think with most, unfortunately, I think the pattern of technology, how technology gets adopted, is like pretty consistent. And so really what you're looking for is use cases that are valuable to people, that can only be solved using the technology that we've built. Turns out capitalizing projects, trading these like native assets on these things is totally a use case. If you go all the way back to ICOs, that's a form of capital formation. Liquidity mining is a form of capital formation. All these kinds of things that have happened in the space, and then all these things need to get traded around. And so I think that's why this ecosystem of DeFi exists. And frankly, if you want to use that stuff, you can't. There's no way to do it in a TradFi way right now. So to the people that find that valuable, they're gonna jump through the hoops to do it right now. And really, it's just a question of kind of lowering that barrier, whether it's sort of like on a regulatory basis or just better products out there. But every sort of like fundamental shift like this in the past, like if you think about like when the internet first got started and browsers came out, right? Like most people didn't know how to use a browser, right? They didn't understand, like, it might seem silly now, but like this whole thing of like typing HTTP:// like nobody understood. I mean, people to this day don't understand what that means, right? And yet it's still there, in a lot of browsers, still staring you in the face. People don't understand, URLs and how they're structured and all these kinds of technical pieces, and people have just gotten used to it over time. And so I think that I mention that because when the technological shift creates applications that people find valuable, people will learn the new stuff, right? Like that we've seen that time and again. And obviously, you can make the new applications simpler over time, and that expands the set of folks that can access it over time. But the easiest UIs for something that isn't valuable still isn't valuable. And so I think, especially in a space this early, we need to really be focused on what are the things that are really driving value here, and then focus our efforts on making those things easier to access. And in a really interesting way, I think right now, from at least some of the data that we have, it's interesting to see that the NFT and DeFi communities seem to be somewhat disjoint. But NFTs as an application, as sort of like digital status symbols, and sort of like a community membership and things like this, opened up a whole new type of use case, a way for people to financially organize across the internet in a new way. And that probably brought anywhere from like 10 to 100 million wallets online for people that had never used these things before, right? And it's not like MetaMask, suddenly got easier to use to just because NFTs came out. It's because NFTs actually tapped into some use case that people wanted, and people were willing to go through all this. And so that's kind of what I'm always looking for, and that sort of helps me think about where the value is and why people are coming into this space.
On NFTs, Ken, I think there's an interesting point there. It's sort of like acts as a sense. It gives people a sense of identity that they can tie themselves to. And I was wondering if you've seen it. There could be an interesting idea where you create a wallet that is pretty NFT centric, where your wallet is tied to your NFT avatar, and then you can basically set different things and then use that as a way to. So basically, your wallet identity revolves around the NFT that you own. And also wondering if you've seen any good wallets out there that actually leverage NFTs.
Yeah, I know there's a bunch of wallets that are working on this type of thing. I don't know, I don't know one off the top of my head that's actually fully leaned into the identity thing, but like, like a bunch of us have our Twitter profile pics as NFTs, right? And so yeah, that identity element I think is super fascinating. Obviously, when there's more NFT collections and there are people to collect them, that starts to break down a little bit. But I think the core early NFTs definitely have communities around them. There's a reason why I use this particular NFT as my profile picture. It's sort of a signaling mechanism in the space, I think, and that's real, right? Like there was no great way to do that before. Like maybe you could have a lot of Reddit karma, or like there's kind of various like Web 2 ways to do that. But this is something that's open and you can kind of bring anywhere, and it's sort of at least within this community is recognized quite readily. And so yeah, a lot of people kind of laugh at that, but we always talk about sort of digital Rolexes and how many people see my NFT versus how many people see whatever watch I happen to have on my wrist. Like there's several orders of magnitude more people see my NFT. So if that's my goal, to get people to understand that I'm associating with the community, this thing is a way better value than anything that I could put on my wrist.
No, absolutely. I think speaking of NFTs and just general adoption around that, and I think this actually reminded me of like the narrative. This like, Solana narrative has been around, like how it's going to be an NFT chain and the DeFi on Solana is not going. So, and the reason I bring Solana up is because I think my follow-up question earlier there was around again focusing back on how do you build more user-facing products, and I think one of the things we were discussing previously was around even exchange, right? And I think my thesis here is over time, when you're optimizing for transactions per second and so on, the way it would shape up is you will have like one chain that acts as the execution layer, and then every other chain is going to act as a settlement layer, right? So for example, uh, if you want to onboard user to your platform, and they natively own tokens on Ethereum or let's say Polygon or something, they basically use that to bridge into the chain where all the transactions take place. So you go and you deposit your Ether, and then you mint your equivalent on the chain where you want to do all the execution. And this chain happens to be your fast execution environment where the latency is somewhat of a non-issue. It's much cheaper, and that's how people transact. And then if they want to exit from your application, then they again go back to the native chain where they held their assets, right? So I think that could be an interesting way to do it, because that also sort of replicates the behavior that people are used to these days, where you go on an application, then you on board by making a deposit and then transacting on that application, right? So in that sense, I was curious to hear your thoughts on what chains do you think are gonna emerge like sort of victorious in the sense of which can become the execution layers, because there's a bunch of new developments. So Solana has already been promising like high transactions per second, but the recent turn of events, people feel somewhat some reservations around that. And there's obviously the Move ecosystem that's evolving, the Celestia as well that's coming up. So and then there's obviously the Cosmos ecosystem as well. So I was curious to hear, first of all, what do you think about that thesis, and also, do you have any particular thoughts on these L1s and where it's going, especially given that you guys also have a closer insight into the working stuff of many of these L1s. So curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, yeah. So I think there's a few things there.
Mhm.
I think in terms of sort of this idea that there's going to be a hierarchy of chains, or people are going to bridge stuff around to whether it's Solana, whether it's L2s, or whether it's Aptos and Sui, or anything that's or near, or like there's a whole list that you can kind of rattle off. Um, I think that's generally right. I kind of based on where we are today, like my best guess is that Ethereum probably becomes the kind of the cold storage chain, or just like very, very high value transaction, high security chain. And then a lot of the things that are, sort of would maybe fall into the like high frequency type of trading or retail type of trading, in the TradFi sense, would probably happen on cheaper chains, just because, you know, uh, usually the scalable nature of those chains in terms of transaction throughput and latency also lend themselves better to those use cases. Solana in particular, I think is interesting. It's obviously sort of in a tough spot right now, just given all the recent events. That being said, I generally think that most chains need to go through sort of one big hype cycle to really prove themselves. Some of the developer data that we look at all the time suggests that there's still like a fair number of people on Solana. The developer community is still there, and Solana is probably like one of the only sort of like non-EVM chains that has really kind of managed to build a unique, differentiated developer community. And so, as long as those folks kind of continue to work there, yes, there's ups and downs, and crypto are just part of the space, and it's really about how those communities continue to survive and continue to build through all the hype cycles. And again, we're sort of coming out the one end of a hype cycle there, and it's I think right now is the real test. But we work with several teams that are building over there, and still are pretty excited to see what they're going to put out. And then longer term, I think that's a much harder question to really lay really any stakes in the ground. One of the things that I really look for is, I think to a large extent, L1s or these platforms live and die by the ability of their sort of like either their core team or the sort of the whales in the community to like reinvest into those ecosystems. There could be chains that raised a lot of money from investors and then just kind of hold on to those funds and don't really use it to bootstrap an ecosystem. I think basically those types of systems don't win in the end, and it really takes foresight on the part of kind of the core stakeholders of that system to realize that actually by sharing ownership of the system with new projects that get built on top of you, you're actually increasing the value of the whole. And if your community doesn't really understand that, then you just end up with a bunch of hodlers that like don't reinvest, and I think that's kind of long term bad for most of these ecosystems. So it's hard to make any predictions right now, but that's generally what I look for is how good at how much investment is happening in these spaces.
Yeah, I think my thesis around Solana was, Solana has succeeded in creating its own cult, right? And that is independent of any other evangelist talking about it. Like, they have their own dev ecosystem. I think after Ethereum, they likely have the largest dev ecosystem that is excited to build on Solana, which is quite interesting, right? So because on one hand, after the SBF debacle and all the sell-off, we imagined Solana DeFi is gone. It's not coming back. And at the same time, there is a case we made that Solana just went through their Ethereum 2018 movement or moment where all the speculators left, and the people who are remaining are the ones who truly believe in it. And there's a whole lot of people who actually do feel that way, that anything that gets built from now on in the next cycle, it could be pretty interesting, right? So that's sort of my thesis on Solana, but we haven't made a decision yet on how and when to build on Solana. But at the same time, I'm like somewhat neutral in that I don't think it's completely gone. At the same time, I also want to see where is this excitement temporary, or is it going to actually sustain over long term?
Yeah, totally. And I think the timing is particularly interesting because a lot of the Solana DeFi projects really kind of like multiplied during DeFi summer, right? And I think a lot of them, for better or for worse, probably just weren't super thoughtful about the tokenomics around those projects. And so I think a lot of the early Solana DeFi projects have now sort of unfortunately built a reputation of like having kind of very unfriendly or kind of unsound tokenomics that they have to unwind out of. And but if you go back to, like you said, ICOs and Ethereum, I mean, those were even worse, right? For in a lot of cases, they were just a white paper, and at least and so if you think about kind of 2018, really in early 2018, I don't think we were even really calling it DeFi back then. And people were saying, well, the ICOs are dead, so what's going to happen next? And really, what came out of it was these protocols and some of these liquidity mining ideas. And granted, I don't think we're there. We haven't seen the end of liquidity mining, and there are much better ways to do it that the space is learning. But I think you can also look at that stuff and say, hey, this is like a meaningful step beyond the ICO kind of model of doing this, where now people have to put out protocols, they actually have to work, you have to commit some assets to get these tokens, and et cetera. And that is a huge step forward in terms of how sound these things are compared to how most ICOs went about their business. And right now, if you sort of draw the parallel, a lot of these Solana projects kind of did liquidity mining 1.0, and I don't see a lot of them really even using some of the more advanced tokenomic schemes that we see over in Ethereum land quite yet. And so and I've talked to founders on the Solana side that are actually quite skeptical of some of the liquidity mining schemes that they've seen, and as they should be, right? They don't a lot of the simpler ones just attract a bunch of mercenary capital, and then it leaves when it's over, and the system is no better for it. But that isn't to say that there are much better ways of doing this, and that's what we should be really looking for going forward. Is that, like, does this space evolve, and does it learn from its sort of past mistakes and come up with more sustainable models? And there's nothing to, at least there's no clear evidence to me right now that that's not going to happen. You can't guarantee that it's going to happen, but there's still a bunch of people working on projects and being thoughtful about this. So, forward progress is not hard to find.
Speaking of sustaining things long term, I was also curious to hear your thoughts on what you think is a sustainable tokenomics model, because I think on one hand, like the last cycle, everything was all about like doing airdrops and then bootstrapping the early users and then seeing what happens from there. But I feel like the whole airdrop model is somewhat getting outdated in the sense that it's no longer like attracting like users. It's rather attracting just mercenaries who are out there for the projects, and then just the airdrop farming or airdrop hunting and so on. So I'm not sure if that tactic is it used to be as attractive as it used to be back in the day. And I was curious, are there any other interesting trends that you could use to make it more aligned, where it's not like the mob is forcing the team to basically extort money and then later on going somewhere else.
Yeah, totally. So I would put sort of airdrop, like a lot of airdrops, and it's hard to make any universal claims about this because there's so many different types of airdrops. But a lot of the airdrops that we saw, a lot of the simple liquidity mining type of examples that we saw, if you just kind of think about them, like they're built to attract very short-term oriented users, right? Because they get liquid tokens immediately. Sometimes they get them into very illiquid markets. And so they can cash them out very effectively. And unfortunately, we kind of played this game for a little while where everyone looked at TVL and sort of everyone had this mental model of, well, high TVL means high token value, and well, if the token value is higher, then the liquidity mining rewards are worth more, which drives more TVL, and you kind of get into this cycle. And like you said, it just attracts all this kind of mercenary capital, and it attracts a bunch of people that are not aligned over the long term. And so, while all of this is happening, I think probably one of the most fascinating ecosystems, and I spend a lot of time in the threads that I write, talking about this, is that I think the stuff that's happening around Curve and Convex and vote escrow lockups and things like this is obviously it's kind of a version one of this stuff, but it's very fascinating to see, because you're starting to see protocols actually deliberately spend their treasuries to acquire convex tokens so that they have a say in this kind of economic engine that is created in this space. And that's and you have lots of holders that are not only saying they're going to hold, but actually have committed to smart contracts to be tied into the system for 1, 2, 3, 4 years in these things. And so I think when you start to see these types of phenomenons, you kind of realize that actually, tokens. I think it's short-sighted to just think about tokens as being something where you just hold it in the moment and it's always completely liquid, and that's sort of the end of it. The beauty of smart contracts really is that we can make promises about the future in really interesting ways. And so, all this kind of like vote escrow type stuff, I think it was really interesting. One of the big ironies is that, synthetics, which I think had one of the first, and probably the more effective kind of liquidity mining schemes, actually had a 1-year vest schedule on the rewards that they gave out. And nobody sort of like copied that for a long time. And so, I do think there's lots of designs to explore here with how can we attract users into a protocol, but then make sure that they have long-term alignment. Some simple idea might be you give, instead of just giving like pure unlocked liquid tokens to people for liquidity, you give them tokens that vest over some quite long period of time. And yes, like compared to another protocol that's just giving out tokens, in the short term, you may lose out a little bit, but to the folks that are willing to kind of believe in you and be long term aligned with you, I think those are the users that you actually want to attract with these types of activities, rather than someone that's just there for the short term win.
Thanks, Ken. I actually just pinned I guess it didn't pin. I'm about to pin a tweet that Elon Musk commented on. It's a quote from him that says, "We should look at currencies from an information theory standpoint. Whichever has least error and latency will win." Can we elaborate on that?
This is interesting because this actually goes hand in hand with what we've been discussing in terms of what L1s could win and what kind of currencies, what other, but Ken, maybe, go ahead.
Yeah. This makes me think of like, when in the bridge space, there's sort of this interesting design question of like, should a bridge just focus on bridging tokens back and forth? And I think if you just focus on that, you can get to like some simple but effective designs. Or is it sort of does it sort of think about capturing arbitrary state on different chains, and being able to there's these models of like, oh, I can like invoke a smart contract on another chain and get its result back. And from a programmer's point of view, that's like a very powerful concept. But I think from an implementation point of view, it's the surface that you have to support is much wider. And so that this quote sort of made me think of that, is that I think there is this model in the world where you do have a bunch of different chains, and the core like information exchange between the chains is just tokens, right? And there's sort of these seemingly simple things, maybe tokens and NFTs, right? If you want to call NFTs tokens, but there's these kind of like very simple standardized packets of value that go back and forth. And that's all we really need to create a very broad ecosystem of applications. And that might sort of, fly counter to how some people think about it sort of technically, but I think that's like a very possible place that we end up.
I think you summarized sort of what I was thinking about that, or how I was seeing that. But I think I don't have anything to add on top of it. By the way,
there's nothing to add on top of it.
But by the way, Nicole, I also want to mention that got a hard stop at 11, so perhaps time for any last bit of Q&As.
Yeah. if anyone has a question, they can certainly comment on the space and we can ask Ken. But Ken, I wanted to ask you, what are you excited about? Because I know you're investing in a lot and seeing a lot of what's going on. What are you excited about in the future of DeFi and crypto?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about kind of what I was talking about earlier, how I think this kind of like selection moment just happened uh, in this space. And so someone had this really great analogy the other day where they called like DeFi lending is sort of like the senior debt in within crypto. And what they meant by that was that if you look at all these collapses, any of these companies that had actual DeFi lending going on paid off all their DeFi loans before they went insolvent. And so I think for people who are paying attention, that's great evidence that like some of the stuff like really works even within these like quite hostile environments where people on the other side are potentially not following the rules or kind of not going about things in sound ways. And so yes, like right now most of the world doesn't understand enough about crypto and the nuances of these differences that like I think we have to wait for some of this stuff to get sorted through. But going into next year, going into the middle of next year, I'm hoping that there's an opportunity where once sort of everyone gets a little bit more educated on this stuff, that there is an opportunity to point out that actually, hey, look, this DeFi stuff, like for the most part, did just fine through all of this. It's a real sort of like notch on its belt at this point. And get a lot of momentum around people understanding that this is actually the right way to do these kinds of things going forward. And if the community as a whole can kind of like unify around that message, um, I think there's a lot of potential to then capture the spotlight again.
Very well, very well said. Varun, what are you excited about?
I think like I always say, I think this is kind of where the DeFi space is maturing, and I think I'm basically looking forward to how we can build applications that are going to basically onboard the the broader set of audience into the space, right? So this essentially comes on how do we build, because until now, uh, still the much of the DeFi feels like uh, mostly like a hacky version of it, where you basically, like I said earlier, like most of the applications still feel like they've been just designed to express what a smart contract says, but they're less empathetic to what a user the end user who's using it would want to use it the way they want to use it, right? So I think what would be interesting is to see how do we build the UX that actually resonates more with anyone who just goes, and all the complexities abstracted away, so they're simply just going there and transacting and doing things the way they normally would, right? So I think we haven't quite gone there yet, but I feel like that's probably going to be the shift in the next upcoming years, and I think it'll be cool to see how what kind of applications emerge from that sort of a design paradigm.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of progress to come, which I'm really excited about too. Ken, thank you so much for joining us. It was such a pleasure. Um, we do this show every week on Thursday. Next week we have Natalie Brunell who's going to talk to us about Bitcoin. So we're gonna go backwards a little bit. Well,
Backwards or
is it
forward?
backwards? Is it just? It's just we're starting from the beginning.
So
Um,
we're visiting history.
we're visiting history. We're visiting blockchain history, which we need to do. It's important. So, Ken, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great. Your Twitter threads are great. Highly recommend everybody follow Ken and hope you join us again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.